The voice said, "A very good joke, indeed. An excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over our wine."
The Amontillado, I see.
Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo? The Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone. Yes, I said, let us be gone. For the love of God, Montresor. Yes, I said, for the love of God.
So, this is the coat of arms for the Montresor family. It shows a golden foot stomping on a snake with the serpent's head returning an injury by biting the heel of its attacker. But perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. Who's Montresor, you may be asking? Then again, just by clicking on this video, you probably know. You know what, never mind. Montresor is the main character in Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. The story is so named because it features Montresor luring a man into the catacombs under the pretense of tasting the sherry wine, Amontillado. I won't spoil what happens from there in case you want to read it for yourself, even though you'll probably piece it together in the next minute or so. But I do want to touch on some of the more interesting facets of this story. See, as a graduate in English, I think about this story a lot. But I'd wager even non-English majors think back on this tale from time to time. I see references to this story pop up in memes pretty frequently. And yeah, it's likely that the people creating these memes are also involved in the humanities, but the fact that these images spread demonstrates that the Cask of Amontillado left a lasting impression on secondary English students who had the chance to read it, and I bet it's not the only one. The stories our teachers presented to us in middle and high school English stuck with us for a reason, and our teachers chose them for a reason. They are creative and impactful. But despite how much we think about some of them, are they as good as we remember? Perhaps. I looked back at 8 popular stories that are widely read in high school English to definitively rank them. And of course, by definitively, I mean that this is one guy giving his opinion, which is obviously worth jack squat in the real world. If you have conflicting opinions, I encourage you to share them in the comments below and to be respectful when doing so. But let's get back to the Cask of Amontillado. From the very outset of Poe's story, we understand one thing very clearly. Fortunato has wronged Montresor, not just once, as a matter of fact. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult I vowed revenge. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. So the picture seems pretty clear. Montresor is interested in revenge and his idea of justice. Do you notice something peculiar about this opening? How about the fact that Fortunato has allegedly injured Montresor 1,000 times, yet Montresor doesn't describe a single one of these injuries in detail? Throughout the entire tale, we have no idea what Fortunato did to warrant Montresor's actions in the story. In fact, based on Montresor's own words, it may have simply come down to prejudice against Fortunato's Italian heritage. Besides that, the only offense we ever see Fortunato commit is maybe being a little annoying, but even that's debatable based on one's own reading. The text even shows us that Fortunato goes out of his way to help Montresor. He leaves his party to make sure his French compadre didn't buy a fake bottle of Amontillado. Which brings us back to the coat of arms. Notice that the Montresor family motto is Nemo me impune lacessit. That's Latin for no one provokes me without impunity. The image on the coat of arms represents the phrase with one party being wronged and wronging the other in return. The image is reminiscent of a Bible verse. In Genesis 3:15, as God casts Satan out of the Garden of Eden, he says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Ergo, while Satan can bruise mankind's heel, mankind has the power to bruise Satan's head.
Doctor, what is more serious, a head injury or a foot injury?
A head injury.
Well, you don't have all the information.
So, on the one hand, this biblical allusion would suggest that Montresor is like unto the devil. However, what's interesting is that the coat of arms never specifies if the Montresor family is the golden foot or the snake. If the Montresors avenge those who provoke them, they might be snakes biting stomping feet, or they might be stomping feet killing biting snakes. But even though the coat shows both parties taking deadly blows, Montresor turns out just fine by the end of the story. As mentioned, he claims Fortunato injured him, but we never see that. Such an ending is fascinating because it veers so sharply from the way Poe's short stories usually end. Almost always, the bad actor gets their comeuppance. By twisting the convention, Poe leaves us wondering, was Montresor actually in the wrong? There's so much more to explore here, and as always, I want to hear everyone's thoughts on the story, but let's just leave it at this. The iconography, mystery, and depth behind the story put it squarely in the A tier. This is a good time to mention that for this video, I've limited myself to only one story per author. Authors like Poe and Ray Bradbury have such an extensive list of short stories that they deserve a tier list unto themselves, but I wanted to highlight multiple authors here. Speaking of Ray Bradbury, let's talk about The Veldt. The Veldt is a short story by Ray Bradbury that follows a family in the distant future, living in a state-of-the-art smart home that performs almost any task imaginable. The family's 2 children, Peter and Wendy Hadley, are so well provided for that they have a nursery that projects anything they can imagine. This becomes concerning, however, when their parents realize they've been playing quite a bit in an African veldt with very realistic lions nearby. The story concerns itself with parenthood, nurturing, and activity. It seems to be a cautionary tale against spoiling one's children. Since Peter and Wendy have so many possessions and privileges, they turn resentful as soon as those things are taken away. The hands-off parenting seemingly created sociopathy in the children, either that or emboldened it. While this cautionary parenting reading does absolutely stand up to scrutiny, the broader meaning appears to be an emphasis on the joys of self-sufficiency. Take this conversation between the Hadley parents, Lydia and George. That's just it. I feel like I don't belong here. The house is wife and mother now, and nursemaid. Can I compete with an African veldt? Can I give a bath and scrub the children as efficiently or quickly as the automatic scrub bath can? I cannot, and it isn't just me, it's you. You've been awfully nervous lately. I suppose I have been smoking too much. You look as if you don't know what to do with yourself in this house either. You smoke a little more every morning and drink a little more every afternoon, and need a little more sedative every night. You're beginning to feel unnecessary too. This idea of self-sufficiency feels all the more relevant to the present when George and Peter argue about using a painting robot rather than learning to paint for oneself. In today's world, when we have machines that will create pictures for us, where is the value in crafting a picture by hand? What does relying on these machines do to us? Another point of interest lies in the characters' names: Peter, Wendy, George. These are names taken straight from Peter Pan, a story all about the balance between innocence, purity, and maturity. The irony, of course, is that Bradbury's Peter and Wendy have no semblance of innocence left, ready to use imaginatively violent means to get what they want. One last thing to note is the story's use of synecdoche. Synecdoche is a literary device where a part is made to represent the whole or vice versa. A common example is to say the crown when referring to a royal or the royal family. In this story, Peter and Wendy use their nursery to play in an African veldt, but oftentimes the setting is referred to simply as Africa, as if Africa were nothing but a veldt with bloodthirsty lions. It's all too common for Anglo-Westerners to boil Africa down to its simplest pieces. For example, on the It's a Small World ride at Disney, the African continent is represented by Egypt, Kenya, and various unspecified nations, along with plenty of animals and jungle scenery. The privileged George and Lydia tell Peter and Wendy they can't play in Africa, when what they mean is they can't play in their dangerous, violent veldt, and conflating the two says a lot about what Westerners thought of Africa even in the late 1950s. Ultimately, the veldt is coming in at a C tier for me. There's a lot of great stuff here, genuinely, but I think the story suffers from a lack of specificity. The technology around the nursery just isn't all that fleshed out. And I know Bradbury gets the point across without having to clearly define the confines of the nursery, but it actually kind of distracts from the message. Much like Lydia and George, I'm left with questions as to what Peter and Wendy are capable of. Let's move on to a couple of female authors. The Lottery by Shirley Jackson is likely a short story that most people are familiar with. Now, before I read this story, I had the ending spoiled, and that will unfortunately affect my placement of this story in the ranking. I did mention that this ranking was partially just based on personal opinion, but it's also based on impact, and this story lost a lot of the impact because I knew how it ended, which was unfortunate. That said, there's still a lot to enjoy. The conceit of the lottery is exactly in the name. Each year, various towns perform a lottery to choose one family, then one member from said family, and perform a certain ritual with the chosen individual. The ritual calls attention to concepts such as a scapegoat or catharsis, sort of similar to the Purge films. More than that, however, the lottery is a commentary on tradition. As the titular lottery is taking place and the head of each household is drawing papers, a couple townsfolk speak to each other. "They do say," Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." Old Man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said. "Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves, nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he added petulantly. "Some places have already quit the lotteries," Mrs. Adams said. "Nothing but trouble in that," Old Man Warner said stoutly. "Pack of young fools." Remove the references to the lottery, and Old Man Warner's quote sounds almost verbatim like what people still say today. Something, nothing is good enough for young people, nobody works anymore, etc., etc. Yeah, maybe nothing is good enough for young people because, frankly, the world needs a lot of reform. Just because something has been done a certain way forever doesn't mean that's how it should still be done. That's the main point that Jackson is getting at. Even the story's main symbol, the dilapidated black box from which the town draws papers, represents the troubles of tradition. Every year the villagers know they should replace the box, but they never get around to it. By the time the lottery is over, they put the box back into storage and eventually forget about it. By that same token, one villager, Mrs. Hutchinson, forgot about the lottery entirely, which seems crazy when you know what actually happens to the person who draws the paper with the black circle. People will let terrible things slide in the name of tradition. And in a metatextual sense, the lottery as a story says something about the morbid curiosity that lies in all of us. When the New Yorker first published the lottery, many people thought it was a factual report and wondered if they could see a live lottery taking place in the US or abroad. Much like Bradbury's story, the lottery feels just as relevant today as it did almost 75 years ago. However, like I said, since I knew the ending beforehand, it did take away a lot of the oomph. In fact, any second reading of the story feels less impactful because the intrigue sort of disappears. That said, the story's poignancy and delivery still landed in the B tier for me. Another familiar story is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. The interesting thing about Omelas is that it's not really a narrative. Not exactly, anyway. The bulk of the story is only a narrator telling you to imagine things, and then, by the end, there's a story. Well, kind of. But despite its unconventional storytelling, the tale sticks with so many people. For one thing, the secret of Omelas is rather disturbing, so that would naturally stick with anyone. But more important than the moral dilemma at the heart of Omelas is the challenge in the way we think about achieving a perfect society. I won't go into this too much. A couple of months ago, Little Joel, aka Big Joel, published an old Patreon video where he discussed this idea in greater depth. And in this idea of a perfect society, Omelas confronts the very notion of good versus evil. Le Guin puts it pretty well herself. The trouble is that we have a bad habit, encouraged by pedants and sophisticates, of considering happiness as something rather stupid. Only pain is intellectual, only evil interesting. This is the treason of the artist, a refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain. But to praise despair is to condemn delight. To embrace violence is to lose the hold of everything else. We have almost lost hold. We can no longer describe happy man, nor make any celebration of joy. A commenter on Joel's video made this point, but it's like BoJack Horseman, when Diane feels she must have endured abuse for a reason. In her mind, her abuse must have contributed to the art she created, otherwise it was all meaningless. But in reality, suffering doesn't necessarily happen for any reason. There's no such thing as good damage, but that's for the better. We don't have to justify suffering because suffering doesn't need to and shouldn't have to happen. Good can exist without the prerequisite existence of evil, according to Le Guin, and the story challenges us to think of a society where that's true. So, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is going to go in the B tier, just above the lottery. For me, it takes a second to get going, but once it does get going, boy, it's a doozy. Next up is a story called The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. The story follows Mathilde Loisel, a middle-class French woman who dreams of being part of the upper class. When her husband secures an invitation to a lavish party, Mathilde borrows an expensive necklace to wear. Be advised, I'm going to fully spoil this story, so skip ahead if you don't want to know the rest. Mathilde ends up losing the necklace, and she and her husband have to work for 10 years to pay off a replacement. When Mathilde tells the truth of the matter to the friend from which she borrowed the jewelry, she comes to find that the necklace was a fake all along and only cost a fraction of what they paid for the replacement. On the one hand, the story has some points of interest. Mathilde wants nothing more than to be rich. She wants to do things like wear expensive jewelry, only to find that her friend doesn't even wear real jewelry. Either that or she didn't trust her poorer friend with real jewelry in the first place. Either reading definitely says something about the relationship between the rich and the poor and performativity. Moreover, there's the notion of appreciating life rather than longing for the material. On the other hand, I can't help but feel that the story undermines some of these perspectives. The more I thought about it, the more I felt it made sense that Guy de Maupassant was a wealthy man himself. Take this line from the text. What would have happened if she had never lost those jewels? Who knows, who knows? How strange life is, how fickle, how little is needed to ruin or to save. Now, most likely the audience is supposed to take this line with a big dose of irony, especially since we later find out that the jewels were fake. If Mathilde had merely been honest, she wouldn't have ruined herself as the line suggests. In addition, if Mathilde didn't long for material things at all, she also wouldn't have ruined herself. But in reality, nothing is ever so simple. There are certain material things that people literally can't help but long for, like food, healthcare, and shelter, just to name a few. Money doesn't buy happiness, but it can provide basic human needs that would otherwise cause distress if not taken care of. The necklace is a story that could probably only resonate with the middle class, and no one poorer. The idea of being happy with what you have is so condescending to people who are suffering. On top of that, the story kind of implies that Mathilde isn't rich because she chooses not to be rich, because she's too lazy. Since by the story's end, having worked for 10 years, she and her husband earned about $200,000 in today's US dollars. And sure, $200,000 isn't uber wealthy by any means, but again, the implication that one simply needs to work harder to become wealthy is so tone-deaf. There are people who work their tails off day in and day out and remain below the poverty line. Also, now that I think about it more, the necklace did cost $200,000, but Mathilde and her husband must have paid much more than that since they paid in installments and had to borrow money in the first place to buy it, so who knows how much they actually earned and paid over the 10 years. Oh, and there's also the implication that rich people are inherently beautiful and poor people work themselves into being ugly. And heck, maybe that was true back then with how harsh manual labor could be. Perhaps I am applying too much presentism to this story, but a lot of it rubs me the wrong way. I admit, the necklace is a good teaching tool. It's genuinely effective in teaching students about conventional short story structure, but that almost takes away from it for advanced readers. Personally, I read this story for the first time in college. By that point, I knew it was sort of par for the course for short stories to feature twists at the end. What's more, I kind of felt like de Maupassant telegraphed the ending not so subtly. Like, how did we expect the story to end when there was so much emphasis on the painstaking 10-year labor? I do think the necklace has its place in curriculum, but for me this one's going straight to F tier. Alright, these last three will probably be a little quicker, but from there let's go to The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. The story follows a sailor named Rainsford who ends up on a strange island owned by a rich Russian man. The Russian, General Zaroff, fled Russia after the Russian Revolution, but more importantly, Zaroff is a seasoned hunter. He grew bored of hunting big game and eventually devised a system for hunting human beings on his island, with Rainsford being his latest prey. The story presents multiple interesting questions relating to the sanctity of life and the cycle of violence. However, what hit me hardest in my most recent reading was the idea of the Übermensch, a word meaning overman, as in a man who is above all else. Funny enough, the Übermensch was an idea being deconstructed in Russian literature decades earlier. Take this quote from General Zaroff. "Life is for the strong, to be lived by the strong, and if need be, taken by the strong. The weak of the world were put here to give the strong pleasure. I am strong. Why should I not use my gift? If I wish to hunt, why should I not? I hunt the scum of the earth, sailors from tramp ships, Lascars, blacks, Chinese, whites, mongrels. A thoroughbred horse or hound is worth more than a score of them." Much like another prominent Russian literary character, Zaroff believes that since he was imbued with greatness and further developed that greatness over time, he has the right to dictate the lives of others. The Most Dangerous Game features several moving pieces of interest. However, for me, the tale takes a while to really get going, and once it does get going, I feel that the ideological battle isn't quite as present as it should be in the physical battle. and for those reasons, Connell's story is going in the low C tier. Our penultimate story in today's ranking is The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. Most of you are probably familiar with this story too, or at the very least with the concept of a monkey's paw. The story follows the White family and their acquisition of a severed monkey's hand. The hand, they're told, will grant 3 wishes to whoever holds it. However, Morris, the man who gives it to them, warns the family against using it. From the beginning, he gives an indication of the object's sinister nature. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. Since the White family feels content with everything they have, they wish for a somewhat meager 200 pounds. Upon making the wish, the severed appendage writhes in Mr. White's hand. Later, Mr. and Mrs. White discover that their son, Herbert, died in a machinery accident at work. For the family's troubles, Herbert's company pays them 200 pounds. Amid their grief, Mrs. White urges Mr. White to resurrect Herbert with the monkey's paw. Things progress wildly from there. The most interesting thing about the story is, of course, the titular monkey's paw. The symbol has taken on a life of its own outside the story. When people use the phrase colloquially, it's a shorthand for warning people to be careful what they wish for, or think of the consequences of their actions. Everything about the symbol communicates some form of deception. Usually, when one imagines a wish-making device, something fantastical comes to mind. A genie, a shooting star, a golden fish, and so on. The monkey's paw, however, is strangely sinister. For one thing, it sort of implies that animal cruelty has taken place. What happened to the monkey that this paw came from? How did the paw end up separated from the monkey? The sinister nature is also implied by the way it moves. The fact that it moves at all is obviously unsettling, but according to Mr. White, it moved and twisted like a snake in his hand. Even the very name of the object communicates the underlying deception. Monkeys don't have paws, they have hands.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
However, as entertaining as the symbol is, the monkey's paw is another one of those stories that really only takes one reading to get the full effect. I gotta be honest, I was a little bored rereading this one for the video. I don't know that it justifies its length. Much like Connell's story, it feels longer than it needs to be in multiple instances. Despite everything that works, the whole be careful what you wish for thing has been done to death at this point, and arguably with better execution. This one's going in the F tier. Now, you may have noticed, but the S tier is looking a little empty, and that's where our last story for today comes in, The Scarlet Ibis by James Hurst. This story absolutely wrecks me the first time I read it, and rereading it for this video was almost like reading it again for the first time. It's one of those rare short stories that has that effect. Hurst balances humor and sadness, triumph and sorrow so expertly that I can hardly believe this story exists as it is. It's so good that I really don't want to say anything more about it. I think you should experience it for yourself. But I will leave you with one quote that particularly impressed me on this most recent reading. "There is inside me, and with sadness I have seen it in others, a knot of cruelty born by the stream of love." So here's my ranking. And look, in all actuality, despite how hard I railed on a couple of them, these are all great stories. There's a reason that these stories stand the test of time and still end up in classrooms today. The only reason any of them ended up in the lower tiers is because that's how ranking videos work. I think all of these stories deserve to be read at least once, and as time goes on, my opinion of them will likely change. And on another note, there were several stories I thought to include, namely Harrison Bergeron and The Yellow Wallpaper, among others, but I didn't want to make this video too long. Kind of experimenting with the format here, so if you liked this video, please let me know and I can do more like this in the future. But hey, what did you think of these short stories in high school? What other weird stories did you have to read back in the day? Which ones really stuck with you? What did you think of my ranking? Please tell me everything. And hey, if you like what I do here and you want to support the channel, liking, commenting, and subscribing goes a long way. If you want to go the extra mile, you can support me on Patreon for benefits like early access to videos. I can't thank my patrons enough. Also, if you do become a patron, you're eligible for priority review over on the second channel. Subscribe over there if you want for some writing tips. And if you want, follow me on Instagram to see what I'm reading, and Twitter for whatever else. And keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft.